Welcome everyone at the start of this new week to an episode of Izen in the Dark. Now, if you're asking, Izen, if you're that cold, shouldn't it be better to close the window when it's -2 degrees outside? Shut up. That's too much of a smart thinking for me. Now, what we have at the start of this week is yet another update at how things have been going in the raid. We checked with each other about 9 days ago. So, since then, we have gotten patch 10.0.5, which brought us some balance tuning along the way. So, over time, we had the balance tuning of January the 9th, plus the balance tuning of patch 10.0.5 to look at the possible changes happening to the specs in the raid. So, let's start, first of all, by comparing this with what happened up to last week. After all, last week was just 2 days to 3 days into the new patch, into 10.0.5, so it's not that we could see that many changes. This was the situation. So we could see the growth of some of the buffed specs. The talk of the village last week were the buffed specs, Arms, Shadow, and Devastation Evoker, as well as also Red Paladin being buffed. So after last week, this is the result. This week, we now have a new number 1, which is Arms Warrior. Shadow Priest went up a few rankings, now finding itself in 3rd, and finally, we no longer have a top 2 position made up entirely of rogues, which seemed to have been a thing for quite a while. This expansion, now Arms, Shadow are in the top 3. You also have Devastation Evoker in the top 5 as well, so good shake-ups, good changes to the meta so far in the raid, awaiting for some more changes coming with patch 10.0.7. The difference, of course, is even bigger, which is good to see that Blizzard can pull out these type of changes not that slowly, because this thing you see right here was just from less than a month ago. So, less than a month ago, you had already, for example, both Shadow Priest as well as Devastation Evoker towards the bottom half of the rankings, whereas now they find themselves towards the top. Similar discussions for a few other specs we haven't not mentioned yet, but still got buffed recently. For example, Frostmage. Frostmage was also towards the bottom, in fact, in the bottom 4 specs last month. Now they are in the top half, and as we will see, they are still on the rise. So the continued amount of balance tuning that Blizzard pushed through to quite a few specs has changed the meta by quite a bit compared to the start of this season. A better idea on the growth of the specs can be seen in this graph right here when it comes to Arms Warrior in particular. You can very clearly see the beginning of the buffs of 10.0.5 for Arms Warrior and their spike forward, upwards, making them jump some, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 specs in the course of 10 or so days. That was the magnitude of the buff given to Arms Warrior. Also, by the way, Fury is also gaining quite a bit after 10.0.5, since Fury was also buffed. It's being overshadowed by the level of the buffs to Arms, but Fury was buffed as well. Same discussion for both Devastation Evoker and Shadow Priest. You can see Devastation starts rising after the 9th of January. That's when they were buffed, and then Shadow Priest as well also keeps rising because they were buffed both on the 9th of January and on patch 10.0.5. So those two were the specs rising for the range DPS. You can also see, not nearly as impressive, but Fire Mage has also been rising, and Frost Mage, of course, together because of the buffs they received in patch 10.0.5. So these have been the changes for the ranged DPS. Just to point out the newcomers to the scene, here is the new updated rankings for Terros, which is our default target dummy for pure single target specs. Here is Arms Warrior, now being first, as a testament to the buffs they received. Here is Kurog, which has a lot of cleave damage, a lot of 2 targets being hit, and then 5 or 6 targets, and then back to a couple of targets, 1 target for a bit. That's a very diverse target profile for Kurog, and now we have the unplanned. We have 4 different specs, all buffed, now making up the top 4. Because you have Frost, you have Shadow, you have Devastation, and you have Arms Warrior, all being in the top 4. And lastly, for a more inclusive list of the buffed specs, you have Dathia. Because Dathia sees, towards the top, it sees Fury, it sees Arms, Frost Mage, Devastation Evoker, Shadow Priest, all towards the top half, and all of these specs have been buffed recently. Obviously, even if you are one of these specs getting buffed right here, you might be, a little bit disappointed, because of course what matters the most, at the very least I think is what matters the most, is that you are powerful when the tier launches, when the meta starts being very, very important for deciding your compositions in the raid, etc, etc. Being buffed now and becoming meta now, 2+ months into the tier, perhaps, takes away a little bit of the excitement compared to if you were meta from the get-go, from the release of the raid. Still, compared to the state in which some of these specs were at the release of the raid, like Frost Mage, like Devastation Evoker, like Shadow Priest, I think it's still a definite improvement, and I wouldn't complain too much if I only got to be very powerful now, if I had to wait some 5 to 6 weeks before my buffs came through. It's still definitely better than how you started this season. Now, talking about the tier lists looked through the lenses of subcreation.net, we have no real changes as far as healers are concerned, even though we have gotten quite some changes when it comes to healers, because Mistweaver Monk has received quite a lot of changes. We have gotten many changes to Discipline, although the majority of them were changes for Mythic Plus, not really for the raid. Also, not all of the Resto Shaman buffs are through, so not too many changes when it comes to healers is somewhat expected. When it comes to melee DPS, we do have now an even larger, an even bigger tier list showing up top specs to play in the raid. Because now you have a grand total of 6 of them, compared to last week's 3. Now, not only Outlaw goes down a peg, but now you have the new entries. You have Windwalker Monk getting back up in S tier, you have Enhancement Shaman getting back up, Fury Warrior getting back up, as well as Subtlety Rogue getting back up, with Havoc and Arms Warrior being already there from last week. You also have Unholy being quite a bit further up compared to before. So this is a very competitive list when it comes to the melee DPS. We did not touch on this recently, but for a long time this tier was a tier, you might have remembered me pointing this out every time, how many melee DPS specs were in the top. We would often see 6 out of the top 7 or 8 out of the top 9 DPS specs all being melee. Usually it was either Balanced Druid or Marksmanship Hunter or Demo Warlock, ruining the combo of melee dominance. But after the buffs to some of the specs, like for example Shadow Priest and Devastation Evoker, you thought things would get a little bit more competitive, but once we look at this, we can still see that in the top 10 we still just have 2 ranged specs. In fact, even in the top 11 we just have 2 ranged specs, and those specs are there just because they were gigabuffed. If they were not gigabuffed, it's very likely that the top 10 of performance would have been entirely made up of melee DPS. That's also perhaps why we see so many melee DPS showing up in the S tier of performance of the raid results. At the very least now we have a few better performing specs when it comes to range DPS. Last week we only saw the newly buffed Devastation showing up as an S tier spec. Now we have the additions, we have the return of Balanced Druid, which went missing from the S tier for a couple of weeks, and also finally we have Shadow Priest entering the S tier for the first time. A few other specs growing after being buffed, like Affliction and Beast Mastery, but in particular Frost Mage, which has been buffed by quite a lot. Fire Mage as well also has been buffed and has grown, entering for the first time the B tier in this first season of the raid in Dragonflight. What surprises us more and is perhaps a little bit more disappointing is Elemental Shaman. Elemental is one of the few specs which, unfortunately, has not been touched by Blizzard. And even in 10.0.7, when we will get more balance tuning, that will not be directed at Elemental. The only two specs being buffed or being changed at all for the DPS are Frost Death Knight and the 3 Hunter specs. The best thing Elemental gets, it's a rework of the general Shaman 3, which is not really going to give Elemental more damage. So, surprising that given the current state of Elemental and also given how many of the other underperforming specs have been touched, basically Affliction, Destruction, Frost, Fire, Shadow Priest and Devastation Evoker, as well as both of the Hunter specs, have all gotten buffed multiple times, which basically leaves us with Arcane Mage, Demo Warlock, Balanced Druid and Elemental Shaman as the only 4 range specs to not really receive changes for several weeks now. While it's okay-ish for Demonology and not a problem at all for Arcane and Balance since they are already meta, it's definitely a problem for Elemental, which has not been meta for this entire expansion. That's perhaps the saddest part when we talk about the state of the DPS specs, especially when it comes to the ranged DPS. So, for this week, as far as the update on the situation in the raid, this is about all we have. We have seen more and further improvements to the recently buffed specs, of course, as somewhat expected when it comes to the raid performance. We will see in the next few weeks if the situation will continue to improve for these specs or they will be plateauing at their current situation. But for now, on this Monday, on the start of this new week, this is all we have. So, time to leave each other, and of course, as we leave, as usual, we are starting by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of this channel. You can still help, of course, doing it completely for free, liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are perfectly fine ways to support, just like following me over on Twitter is a fine way to do so. If you ever want to get notified of a few things I have to share with my viewers, that would be the best way to be it. And lastly, one day, the prophecy says I will be streaming again on Twitch as well. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, very likely. And in the meantime, if someone can find where my voice is going, that would be appreciated.